Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 1 on Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. I'm really looking forward to talking about this book. This is a book let me tell you one of the reasons I'm excited to discuss this book. This is a book that I have really enjoyed through my life. I say through my life because I haven't read it, I think, since I was in college. I loved it when I was in college, and I read it several times, but I haven't read it since then. And I have reached one of the things that I have discovered, the best thing I have discovered about getting old, right? There are lots of things about getting old that are not very much fun. You've probably heard about those. What nobody might have told you is that there is a wonderful perk to getting old, and that is, when you get old enough, you can read things for the first time again, right? I remember, so many times, in my teaching career, I would, just love talking to people about, seeing people experience a book that you know and love for the first time, right? And watching them do that. And it's one of the delights of teaching, right? And many times have I reflected on the fact that, it's, what I wouldn't give to be able to, read this book again for the first time. And truly, books that I read continuously, I'm unlikely to really recreate my reading of The Lord of the Rings for the first time because I still read it every year, so it's tolerably fresh. But there are a number of books which now it's been decades and decades since I've read, and I have discovered, to my very great surprise and delight, that when I return to them now, I really am. I kind of remember them, but it really is like reading them again for the first time. And that is so awesome. I would have looked more forward to getting old if I had known that was going to be one of the delightful perks of this. So anyway, so much fun. Exactly. Everything old is new again. I mean, Maureen, I just realized the other week, I'm like, man, I have half of Shakespeare to discover again. I mean, I've read all of Shakespeare's plays, but there are some of Shakespeare's plays I certainly have not read since I was in college, maybe in grad school prepping for my comps or something. So anyway, it's this is going to be great. And this will keep on giving, right? I mean, I have decades in front of me of rereading stuff for the first time. How delightful, right? Isn't this so cool? So I am really looking forward to rediscovering The Name of the Rose and rereading it for the first time with you guys. This is going to be fun. First, just quickly before we get going, just wanted to remind folks, we are getting closer now to Mythmoot. It is nearly the end of May 2024 in real time, and we're just a couple weeks away from June 20th, which is the first day of Mythmoot down in Leesburg, Virginia. So we do have registration open. We had horrible delays this year. Lots of disreputable stories, but much great and noble perseverance on the part of our events team. And we have finally completed getting everything that needed to be done, and registration has opened, and it has been just marvelous to see all of the registrations rolling in. And every year I am always excited to see the list of people signing up for Mythmoot, because it is the reunion I look forward to every single year. So very excited to see folks at Mythmoot. It's our biggest conference of the year. Our regional events that we do throughout the year are small, local sort of tastes and samples of what we're able to do at Mythmoot. And yes, the room registration is open now as well. So anyway, it's gonna be cool. Eric is giving a presentation on Anglo-Saxon art at Mythmoot. Fantastic. Yeah, excellent. That's gonna be awesome. Anyhow, so really looking forward to Mythmoot, hoping to see a bunch of you there. Always fun catching up with people at regional moots, but getting the whole family together at Mythmoot is the thing I look forward to most every single year. All right. But let's get into the text. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention, my sort of title for today's class is A Medieval Secondary World. There was a comment somebody made. I don't remember who it was. I don't remember where it was. As I said, getting old. But somebody at some point in the last few weeks made a comment and said, you know what, Name of the Rose isn't really exactly imaginative literature, which is, more or less what we do here at the Mythgard Academy. First of all, I'm not going to consider myself an absolute slave to that. But anyway, I was thinking about that. When this person that I don't remember said that in a place that I can't recall. No, in one sense, you could say that it isn't. And in fact, the concrete argument that was then furthered was that really it's historical fiction, not imaginative literature. And I was reflecting on this. And I was thinking, first of all, I think that historical fiction is an underappreciated area of imaginative literature. I think it is exactly imaginative literature. Just as someone who writes science fiction is trying to imagine themselves into another world or a future time when our science and technology has changed, or they have, a work of fantasy where they're imagining themselves into a different world where things operate by different rules from ours. The person who writes historical fiction, that is, the author who imagines themselves back into a different place and time, even an author who is attempting to be scrupulous in the observation of historical accuracy. This is still not only as great a work of creative, imaginative creativity as writing fantasy or science fiction, but it actually seems to me as one of a very similar kind, actually. What you're doing is building a secondary world. And the challenge you've set yourself is that you are trying to capture and present as a secondary world, to invite your readers into now, of course, I'm using that term in Tolkien's sense of secondary world, right? Let me not take that for granted. In Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, he talked about the primary world and the secondary world. The primary world being the world that's actually surrounding us, that we can perceive with our senses, and a secondary world being an imaginative world, the world of a story, into which a storyteller invites us to walk imaginatively, right? When we picture the characters and the events in our heads, we are entering imaginatively into that secondary world. Of course, the point that Tolkien was making when he made that definition is he was addressing what is commonly called, and at times rather dismissively, spoken of under the rubric of willing suspension of disbelief. And Tolkien's point, which is one of his many excellent points in his famous essay on fairy stories, is that is not at all a fair description of what happens in a good fairy story, in a good work of imaginative literature, right? The experience of reading a work of fantasy or a work of historical fiction or a work of science fiction should not be the process of merely suspending disbelief. Like, I know that this is not true, but I'm going to suspend the knowledge that this isn't true and just kind of agree politely to roll with it, right? That's kind of the implication of willing suspension of disbelief. And Tolkien says, of course, that's not the point at all, right? The point is that you are being invited into a secondary world, and you are invited to invest belief in it, not primary belief. Receiving a story isn't about primary belief. You don't have to be actually deceived into thinking that a work of fiction is true to enjoy it, right? That's not where the enjoyment lies, necessarily. The enjoyment lies in giving to it secondary belief, as he said, right? And I find that historical fiction in general, and The Name of the Rose in particular, performs exactly that same function, where I am being invited to imagine myself into, to imagine that the characters that I'm reading about, the dialogue that I'm hearing, the interactions that are happening, the circumstances, that this is what, a medieval monastery, ancient Rome, Tudor England, whatever book you happen to be reading at the time, right? Exactly what that was like, right? That is the work of imagination. That is the creative work that is being done. That is the art that is being performed by that storyteller. And as I say, I find it not only very similar to the work that's being done by the fantasy writer or the science fiction writer, but I find that the kind of imaginative step, the sort of secondary belief that I'm being asked to invest in it, is of a very, very similar kind. Anyway, that's that is. Yeah, sorry. People are asking if we've done on fairy stories. We've never done it in the Mythgard Academy. There was a running joke in the early days at Signum, in the early courses that I was teaching there in our graduate program, that I used to put on fairy stories on every syllabus, because I'm like, I need this vocabulary from this essay in order to be able to talk about stuff. So like everyone always has to read that at the beginning of every class. Anyway, so yes, this is, I definitely, in fact, you know what I was reminded of when I was rereading these first few chapters? I was reminded of Watership Down and the discussions we had of Watership Down years ago. The Rabbit book by Richard Adams, one of my favorite books of all time. Because I find that there is a similar, to me it felt a similar kind of level of that too, also a book about rabbits, right? Which is also in its way almost exactly the same as a work of historical fiction, right? A work which is not asking me to believe almost anything different about the world around me, except that I can understand what rabbits are saying to each other and stuff. But in any case, I remember in our discussions of Watership Down, I was talking about the secondary world building that Adams does so well in that story. And we were looking at some of those passages where he really invites us to invest secondary belief in the world of the rabbit as he unfolds it there. And I was reminded sharply of that because I was definitely perceiving that same kind of invitation from Umberto Eco here to imagine ourselves into the medieval mindset. So that's one of the things that I want to focus on here today. There are several things. A couple of you have been referring to Sherlock Holmes, and of course that is one of the other things. In fact, I would say, it's been said many times before that at the core of every secondary world, like every science fiction secondary world, and I think this is very similar to fantasy as well, at the core of every imaginative literature question is a what if question, right? What if this were true, right? Like, for instance, one of the fundamental what ifs of Tolkien's world is like, what if there was another rational race, right? What if it wasn't just humans? What if there were humans and elves? What would the world be like then? I think the way that I would characterize, certainly from what we get in these first few chapters, how I would characterize the beginning of The Name of the Rose, or the sort of the what if premise of The Name of the Rose, is what if Sherlock Holmes were a medieval friar instead of a, Victorian man about town, right? Consulting detective. And it's, yeah, Eric, you absolutely can almost imagine an argument that Edzo and Watson are related. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But anyway, yeah. So it's that seems to me, it just screams at you out of these opening chapters. The not just the chain of deductions that Brother William performs about Brunellus the horse, right, in the first chapter, but everything about the spirit of Edso's interrogation and marveling at the acumen of his mentor. It is so directly Holmes and Watson that it seems to me, at the risk of, a statement which is transparently critfic, it really seems like we're supposed to be thinking of them there. Doesn't seem to be the slightest interest in concealing that premise, that it really is a what if Sherlock Holmes were a medieval monk kind of question, and that's really interesting. I think that is a fascinating and really fun premise. And again, strikes me as so similar to the kind of premise that a fantasy work or a science fiction work will have, that again, I can't see any reason for drawing that distinction. And I would say in general, and Maureen, I think this picks up on something that you were saying before too, that I also think one of the other reasons that I don't especially care about, I'm not going to be weeding out, when people nominate books that are not, strictly speaking, fantasy works or science fiction works. That's mostly what we do here. And that's, kind of the heart of what we've been doing in the Mythgard Academy for these many years now. You realize it's been 11, almost 12 years now we've been doing this. Anyway, so I think the very first Mythgard Academy thing ever done was done almost exactly 12 years ago, summer of 2012, as I recall. Anyway, anyway, the point is, I think that in general, as Maureen was suggesting, she was like, aren't all books works of imaginative literature? How do you write a book without using your imagination, right? And I think that that's exactly correct. I think that the kinds of distinctions, genre distinctions, I'm not going to say that genre distinctions are meaningless. There are some, questions that are more important or interesting to ask of one group of books compared to another or something. I'm not going to try to say that there's no distinction of any kind among different sorts of books. But I will say that I think that modern readers tend to put far too much weight on that sort of thing, and speak as if, there were that, especially, and this is my least favorite phrase of all of the phrases that, English professors tend to use when in describing these things. Genre fiction. It's my least favorite one. That phrase just blows my mind, actually, right? Implying what? That other works of fiction have no genre, right? Are just in some other kind of category. It's almost, I think, perfectly ridiculous. The genres absolutely are about marketing, Charles, more than anything else. That's why it bothers me when people speak of these genres. I mean, it makes sense. If you own a bookstore, it makes perfect sense to help people find the sort of book that they're going to be most interested in by putting them in different categories, right? It's a perfectly sensible approach to selling books, right? But when people then turn that around and speak as if the labels that are put on bookcases in bookstores actually have some kind of deep and objective like that there's some kind of deep and objective difference between the books on the different bookshelves and libraries. You very swiftly, I think, begin to talk complete nonsense. And Eric, you're right. Using them as an interpretive structure is, I think it's silly at the end of the day. Yeah. Anyway, enough ranting and pontification on that point. But I did want to just kind of address as we and not only because in the interest of like defending why we're talking about the Name of the Rose at all, but also to give that introduction about secondary worlds, because as I said, I'm going to be doing I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on that this week, rather than just focusing on the sort of events of the book, because I want to be sort of looking together at some of the ways in which Eco is inviting us into that secondary world, in particular because I think he does such a good job of it. And the world that the secondary world he's inviting us into is a medieval secondary world. And there are many ways in which medieval people thought very differently about things than we do. And I think that it is important for us modern readers to be on our guard against some of our own biases and prejudices. And I would encourage everybody to open your mind and don't just assert your own mental categories on things and assume that the characters are thinking the same way. I think that Eco is trying very hard to have his characters speak, and to the extent that he can, think in the way that medieval people seemed to certainly spoke and wrote, and how they seem to think. And that's a super fun project. And so I think that we can, obviously you're learning Umberto Eco's interpretation of that, his idea, his imagination of what that might have been like. But if we open ourselves to that, I think we can learn a good deal, that I think will put you in an interesting place. I can say from my own experience in reading medieval literature, I think that he gets a lot of things right, and will put you in an interesting place to pick up some things about medieval thought that you might not have had. So let's sort that out. And Eric is certainly correct that there's a bit of an extra payoff in this, in that learning the medieval worldview helps quite a lot in understanding some of our favorite authors. Certainly true. Yeah. Okay. So let us start at the beginning. This is the beginning of the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was beginning with God, and the duty of every faithful monk would be to repeat every day with chanting humility the one never-changing event whose incontrovertible truth can be asserted. But we see now through a glass darkly, and the truth, before it is revealed to all, face to face, we see in fragments, alas, how illegible, in the error of the world. So we must spell out its faithful signals, even when they seem obscure to us, and as if amalgamated with a will wholly bent on evil. Okay, all right. Let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, I'm not going to apologize for the fact, but I do want to acknowledge the fact that if you do not know the Christian Bible, you're going to be at a touch of a disadvantage throughout the discussion of this book. So I'm going to try to fill in some of those gaps. I want to urge people not to be afraid to ask about it. Like, I don't want to assume that everyone's tracking with what's going on here. I also, at the same time, don't want to turn this into every week into a long lecture on Christian theology or the Christian Bible, the New Testament, and Old Testament as well. Anyway, so I don't want to turn this into a Bible class, but I don't want to make assumptions either. So I'm going to try to kind of go in between those two things there. The important thing here, what I want to draw attention to. So yes, it is important that you know that the first sentence here is a quotation of the first sentence of the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is an enormously important statement. What I want to emphasize, though, I don't want to just digress and talk about why that statement at the beginning of the Gospel of John is important in the context of the Gospel of John. What I want to draw attention to is why Adso is bringing this up, because it's enormously relevant to the entire project that Brother William is doing throughout this story. This is going to be one of the primary themes of this entire book, and this theme is announced like 10 times throughout these chapters that we talk about. But it's one of those things that's kind of easy to miss if you're not tracking with the basic vocabulary. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos in Greek, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The Word is then later on in the first chapter of John, he goes on to explain that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. He's talking about the incarnation. This idea of God and the Word, that the Word, like the Word, the very power of God in creation. How did God create the world? In Genesis chapter 1, by speaking the world into being, right? By uttering the words, let there be light, and light was, right? The Word of God is the authority of God. Notice that the Word of God, when God speaks those words in creation, he speaks the words and the things are. The things come to be. Brooktail says, is the word here Jesus or language? Yes. Yes, it is. It is the word that God speaks. It is the idea that God utters and puts forth into action. It is the power behind creation itself. All of those things are the word. It is also the being which is God, but is also with God, and was with God from the beginning, and is made flesh in the form of Jesus. Yes. That is, so yes, both. Now, the important thing, the theme that I am talking, well, let me not just preach to you about the theme. Let's follow how Adso points to the theme. Notice where he goes with this. This was beginning with God and the duty of every faithful monk. How do you begin a day with God? You begin a day with God. That's what you're supposed to do as a monk, right? Time out, back up. What's a monk? Do we know what a monk is? Let's talk about the monastic orders very briefly. What's the point of a monk? What is the life of a monk? What does it mean to be a monk? This is one of those things that Adso is going absolutely to assume and is not going to explain, right? So if you don't know anything about monks, you ought to know a little bit of something about monks. Monks are men who have sworn oaths, they've sworn vows, and their vows are, they take vows of stability, vows of celibacy. They enter into a monastery. The idea of being a monk is to retreat from the world. To retreat from the world, the active life, that is to say, to live out in the world, and to devote yourself to the contemplative life. You become a monk in order to spend your time with God, to devote your life, to make your life into a pattern of contemplative devotion to God. At its root, that is what it means to be a monk. Now, we're going to see more about specifically what it meant to be a monk within this world that the story is taking place in, right? So we'll see some more of that specifically unfolded there. Another brief thing, let me explain friars and monks. This is an important distinction. Will become an increasingly important distinction. It's a little bit important in the context of this story. You don't have to know all that much about it, but you should know a little bit about it. Friars also are, both monks and friars are what were called in the Middle Ages religious orders. That is to say, the religious are those who take vows, enter into a particular order, and dedicate their lives according to the rules of their order. That's what it means to be one of the religious, or a member of a religious order in the Middle Ages. The word religious did not have the same meaning at all that it had today. So when you hear a medieval person or in a medieval context talking about the religious, it does not mean a person who believes in God or a person who practices religion. It means a person who has taken a vow and entered into a religious order. Now, friars are also a religious order. The difference, friars are a recent innovation. This story takes place in the early 14th century, in the early 1300s. Friars have not been around that long. They've been around for less than 100 years. Monks go back, way back to St. Augustine and before. Monks have been around already by this time for almost 1,000 years. Monasteries are a very, very old, well-established thing in Christendom by this time. Friars are brand new. Friars, who are called that, they're after frater, brother, the brotherly orders, the friars, the fraternal orders, as they are called. And there are two orders. There are Franciscan friars who take vows of poverty. And there are the other ones. This is the thing I hate most about growing old. The downside of growing old is that, like, I can't recall things anymore. Dominicans, thank you. The Dominican friars, basically they were just the two different orders, two different people who had the same kind of impulse at the same time. And that is, hey, let's do a new order of monks, right? Where we'll establish a religious order where people take vows and dedicate themselves to God and, live a very strict life and everything. But instead of taking an oath of stability, meaning we'll stay in one place, which monks usually couldn't leave the monastery. That's part of their oath. Instead of going apart from the rest of society, they're like, what would be even cooler? What would be even cooler is if people who took religious orders went out among the people. Right? So they're like monks, except they travel around and they can do good and they can teach and it'll be awesome. Like, they can have so much more impact on society than the monks who just go away from society and leave it behind. Right. So the followers of St. Francis, Franciscans, the followers of St. Dominic, were the Dominicans. The Dominicans were focused on teaching. The Franciscans were primarily famous for their oath of poverty. They were not allowed to own anything, which meant as they went around the world, they had to survive on the generosity of others. That is to say, they had their food for every day was only given to them by others. They weren't allowed to carry or own anything. So they were called the mendicant friars, the begging friars, because they had to beg for their daily bread on a daily basis. Yes, JJ, of course, you were remembering. I think, JJ, you may be remembering. Were you in my Chaucer class or something? Anyway, yes, later on in the 14th century, the friars are going to cause a bunch of problems. There will be issues. Things aren't going to go well forever with the fraternal orders, but it's kind of a fun idea, and this is important because, of course, Brother William is a Franciscan. he is he's a friar, whereas the rest of them are monks, and they're Benedictine monks. Benedictine monks, that means they follow the rule of Saint Benedict. There were different sets of monastic rules that you could potentially follow. There was the rule of Augustine, there was the rule of Saint Benedict, which was kind of a revised version of the rule of Saint Augustine, and there were others as well. But the Benedictines were the most that was the most sort of common and representative sort of monk in the Middle Ages. So anyway, so you've got the Benedictine monks and you've got the Franciscan friars wandering around. So there will be times when some of the kind of presumed differences in outlook between the Benedictine monks and the Franciscan friars are going to get mapped out in Brother William's interactions with some of the monks in the monastery. So again, I just wanted to alert you to that fact. All right. Now back to our prologue. We're not getting so far. We're not getting anywhere very fast here tonight. That's okay. This was beginning with God. So a good monk began every day, says Adso, by reciting this verse, the beginning of John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But watch his train of thought in that second sentence. This was beginning with God, and the duty of every faithful monk would be to repeat every day with chanting humility the one never-changing event whose incontrovertible truth can be asserted. The one never-changing event whose incontrovertible truth can be asserted. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There is only one event which does not change. The event of creation. The power of the Word of God. Right? God's assertion of his power, God's manifestation of the reality of creation through his Word. That same Word, according to John 1, which he is reciting here, who is incarnate, who becomes incarnate in the form of Jesus Christ. The one never-changing event whose incontrovertible truth can be asserted. The emphasis here is can be asserted. Okay. See what that means? There is no other event whose incontrovertible truth can be asserted. You might claim incontrovertible truth for some other event, but you can't really assert it. I mean, you can't. There is only one thing that we can be certain of, and that is creation. Why is this a problem? But we see now through a glass darkly, and the truth, before it is revealed to all face to face, we see in fragments, alas, how illegible, in the error of the world. So we must spell out its faithful signals, even when they seem obscure to us, and as if amalgamated with a will wholly bent on evil. Okay, follow that? It's tricky, but it's really, really important. When he says, we see now through a glass darkly, this is another quotation, of course, as several people have pointed out already. He's quoting chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, one of the New Testament letters. This is the very famous love is patient, love is kind. If you've ever been to a wedding, if you've ever been to a Christian wedding, you probably have heard this chapter read out. It ends with this statement. We now see through a glass darkly. Time out. Do you know what that means? That's a direct quotation, by the way, from the King James English translation of the New Testament, but we see now through a glass darkly. Do you know what that means? What glass is he talking about? The word glass in the 17th century, when the King James translation was made, does not mean glass pane. It means a mirror. Absolutely. A looking glass. Exactly. This idea, this metaphor that Paul uses, that we see in a glass, we see the world in a glass darkly. We see it in a really bad mirror, a really cloudy mirror. We can't see it clearly. It's a mirror, but we can't see the pictures clearly at all. We only see through a glass darkly the truth. This is the world that we live in. And so is concerned from the very beginning that we don't have direct access to truth. Well, not other than the one incontrovertible truth that he's already mentioned, i.e. creation, right? That act in which God's word manifested creation. That was the only time when the word and the thing are one. Absolutely one, right? Hence the importance of the word there, and why he quotes from John 1 instead of Genesis 1. In the beginning was God. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The beginning of Genesis 1, which is what John in his epistle is referring, or in his gospel is referring to. Okay. So is concerned. Since the world that we live in is a world in which we see through a glass darkly, there will come a time, Adso believes, when the truth will be revealed to all. We will see God face to face someday. This is a thing that should be tolerably familiar to us from the last book that we did. For those watching asynchronously, it was only a few weeks ago that we were still talking about Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. But we will all be confronted by the truth face to face someday. But before that happens, until that happens, all we see are fragments. Alas, how illegible. Notice how he's overlaying the metaphor of the mirror, the images in the mirror, with a different metaphor of seeing fragments of a text, illegible, like trying to make out an illegible text, a probably faded, fragmented text that you can barely read. Adso says, and that's of course a very monastery-like, it's a metaphor that comes readily to the mind of somebody who works in a monastery, right? So Adso argues that all of life, our whole interaction with the world, is looking through a glass darkly, is seeing illegible fragments in the error of the world. So what do we do between now and when the truth is revealed face to face? What can we do? What do we do? All we can do. So we must spell out its faithful signals, even when they seem obscure to us. Fortunately, see, we don't have access to truth. We see through a glass darkly. We don't see things. We cannot see to the heart of things and see what really is. But we can see things. And we have this comfort that the things that we see point to truth. Footnote. I will, as I am doing right now, and I will at many points throughout the rest of the class, I am, in our discussions, I am entering into the secondary world, right? I am going to say at times things like everybody knows or as we all know or something like that. When I am doing that, I am not in fact assuming that all of you participating in this discussion or listening to this discussion share these fundamental beliefs, right? I am instead trying to invoke the secondary, to explain and point to the secondary world that Umberto Eco is laying before us here. Okay, just wanted to make sure everybody understands the context of that. So if you find yourself resistant, if you find yourself saying, but I don't believe that, I don't think that's right at all, that's great. That's very interesting. Don't stop. Just stop. in as much as you do that, if you resist this, you're not gonna enjoy this book at all, because it's to do that is to refuse to enter in, to refuse to give secondary belief to this world that he's creating. He's inviting us in to Adso's world, right? And so we get to put ourselves into Adso's frame of mind. Again, you don't have to share it. You don't have to live there yourself. You don't have to stick around. But if we're going to do the thing, we should enter into that world, and try to understand it from within. Anyway, okay. So we must spell out its faithful signals. Faithful signals. The things that we see, they're fragments. They're illegible fragments. We're not going to get it. We won't know the message that God is saying. We won't be able to read accurately the story that God is telling. We won't know truth. But we can know that the things that we do see point to that truth, even when they seem obscure to us. We might not understand them, right? But the signals are faithful. And so we must, says Adso, and I think his we here, I think he's speaking in part for like the monastic perspective. He's speaking as a medieval writer. What is his job as a narrator? How does he understand himself as a storyteller? What he's telling us is, I don't know the truth. I don't have necessarily a message I'm trying to reveal. I haven't figured stuff out, right? I'm just Dr. Watson over here, Adso would say, right? But what I can do, what I must do is spell out the faithful signals. Even if I don't know what they're pointing to, even if I don't see the big picture, that's okay. I'm going to do that with humility, so that others might perhaps someday be able to see them, right? We must spell out its faithful signals even when they seem obscure to us and as if amalgamated with a will wholly bent on evil. When they seem obscure. So it's not just that we can't get it. There's another problem here. And the problem is the signals that we see are sometimes jumbled together maliciously. We have not only ignorance to contend with, there is wickedness to contend with. The people whose words and deeds so often form those signals to the truth, which we may not perceive and almost certainly won't fully understand. Many of the people whose words and deeds form those signals are themselves evil and confused and driven by corrupt desires. The whole thing is a mess. And furthermore, the devil himself stalks about, perpetrating evil and inspiring to evil. And his plan is to mess everything up entirely. So, yeah. So, following this, you can see already he's setting himself up as Dr. Watson, right? This is how the medieval Dr. Watson thinks, right? His job he's already explained to us how he views his role as narrator. His role as narrator is to spell out the faithful signals, even when he doesn't understand the full truth of things, right? So, Brother Watson is what he is giving to us here. Okay. Having reached the end of my poor sinner's life, my hair now white, I grow old as the world does, waiting to be lost in the bottomless pit of silent and deserted divinity, sharing in the light of angelic intelligences, confined now with my heavy, ailing body in this cell in the dear monastery of Milk. I prepare to leave on this parchment my testimony as to the wondrous and terrible events that I happened to observe in my youth. now repeating all that I saw and heard, without venturing to seek a design, as if to leave to those who will come after, if the Antichrist has not come first, signs of signs, so that the prayer of deciphering may be exercised upon them. See that? See that? The first sentence is a very well, the whole thing is one sentence, which is awesome. The first half, up to the first semicolon, right, is his way of saying, I'm very old and going to die soon, right? Soon his body is going to be lost in the bottomless pit of silent and deserted divinity, and then he's going to be sharing in the light of angelic intelligences. That is to say, his soul will be in heaven, and his body is going to dissolve. But he's preparing to leave on this parchment his testimony, and notice how he says he's going to repeat all that he saw and heard, without venturing to seek a design, as if to leave to those who will come. So he's like, I'm going to explain, I'm going to give you the faithful signals. I don't understand what I'm talking about. I don't know the significance of what happened. I'm just going to tell you, right? Why? Why is he going to tell us this? So that those who will come after, that's us, by the way. Remember how Lewis made a very similar gesture to this at the beginning of Till We Have Faces? When the stuff about the learned, when Orwell started addressing the learned Greek who was reading this book, right? And, we're in the position of the learned Greeks who are supposed to be doing the interpretation. Anyway, so we're those who will come after. And he's leaving us signs of signs, so that the prayer of deciphering may be exercised upon them. We are prompted to attempt, prayerfully and with humility, to decipher the signs that he's laying out for us, the faithful signals, right? He will tell us what happened, what he saw, and what he saw and heard, and it is our job to interpret it and to see what the meaning of that is. Yes, exactly, Eric. They're signs of signs. I will leave these signs of signs. What he's leaving us is words on the page, right? He's writing words on the page. Those words are signs that point to the things that happen. They're not the things, right? I mean, he can't hand us, his and Brother William's encounter with the horse in chapter 1. Right. He can't do that. All he can do is write signs which point to that event. Right. And of course, he recognizes that event itself points to something else. That's why it's a sign of a sign. Right. So, Maureen, it's not that we're supposed to ignore design. We're supposed to perceive design. That's our job. Right. Adso is saying that he's not trying to impose design. And you'll notice that at several points, we get these asides. I love those moments when Adso talks to himself, right? Or like he talks to his story, but now, oh, my story, you must move forward, right? I love that kind of thing. There's this, the narrator, as Echo is presenting him, is this extremely ingenuous character, right? This sort of wide-eyed, I don't understand anything that's going on. I'm just going to tell you what's going on, and I'm losing control of my own story, right? I'm not shaping this. There is a shape, right? There is truth to be pointed to, but I don't even understand it. So I'm just going to put signs to signs, right? Very brief sidebar, and then Jocelyn, I'll get to the other sidebar. I'm not gonna neglect you there. But sidebar number 1, signs and things. This is a very important. This is a very important medieval idea. Saint Augustine talked about this. This is an important piece of medieval philosophy, which is going to be very relevant. In his work, the De Doctrina Christiana, St. Augustine says, in the world, there are things, Everything is a thing. There's res. That's the Latin word for things. A subset of those res, of those things, are also signs, signa, right? So you've got res and you've got signa. A sign is a thing. Everything's a thing, right? But some things also point to other things, right? So like, for instance, if we think of it in the most literal sense in the modern world, right? A road sign, it's still a thing. Like, it's a piece of sheet metal on a post. You can, you could use it for various functions, right? You can if you live in Tennessee, you can use it for target practice. I'll never forget the first time I drove through rural Tennessee and saw all of the stop signs with bullet holes in them. Anyway, so they're things, but they're also signs, right? They are a thing, but they point to something that is outside itself. They point to other things, right? Like in the case of road signs, they point to an action that you are supposed to perform. So a stop sign is pointing to the action of stopping that is supposed to happen at that intersection. And yes, Jackrabbit, it is extremely important not to confuse the sign for the thing that the sign points to, because they're not the same, right? Now, Augustine goes on to say, there is a subset of signs which are special because they only serve as signs and have no other function at all. And that is words. So you have res, and you have signum, and you have verba in the middle, right? Words, they're things. Everything's a thing, right? They're things. But unlike a sign, like a physical, unlike a road sign, which again could perform some other functions, a bird might make a nest, in one or something. Yes, they are signa tantum, only signs. Yes. So, words are special in this way. The whole point of a word. And so notice that he's kind of embedding this. They are signs of signs. When you take this sort of the literal conception of this hierarchy that St. Augustine outlines, right? That you have words which point to things. You have signs which point to things, but are themselves also things. And then you just have things that are just things, right? So you've got these three categories of things. But when you then impose upon that the sort of the larger theological framework that Adso was evoking there in the first paragraph, the incontrovertible truth, the concept of the logos, the verbum in Latin, the word, the verba, those signs are really important, right? Because in God, in Jesus, in the second person of the Trinity, the verbum became flesh, became carne, right? Became incarnated. When God spoke, when God speaks, when God spoke in Genesis 1 and said, "Let there be light," and light was, his words didn't just point to a sign. They were the thing, right? In God's speech, sign and thing are one. That's why this is the one incontrovertible truth. This is also, so when you think about things, not just as like physical things, but when you think of the thing as the truth being pointed to, right? When Adso speaks of signs, he's invoking this hierarchy. His words, which are only signs, which point to these events that he's going to be narrating, to the story that he's narrating, which are themselves signs, faithful signals of that truth, which we can't read ourselves, which he certainly can't read himself, right? But we might possibly be able to interpret the signs that his signs are pointing to so that we can arrive at truth. And that fundamental hierarchy between verbum and signum and res, or veritas, right? Truth at the top, is really important for this story. This is how he thinks. This is their language. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Following? We good? Okay. That was about half an hour longer than I meant to spend on this. Oh, hang on, Jocelyn. I'm not done with it yet. Antichrist. Jocelyn wanted to learn about the Antichrist. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the Antichrist is a sign of the end of the world. So the Antichrist is, he's referring to prophecies. He's referring to prophecies of the end of the world when a person will arise who will be empowered by the devil to do signs and wonders, and who will lead people to think that he is Jesus returned, but he is going to be deceiving the entire world. And the rise of the Antichrist is one of the signs that the end of the world is just about nigh. Or no, not is just about nigh, is in fact nigh. Like the end of the world is in fact coming. It's actually happening. When he tosses off parenthetically, if the Antichrist has not come first, that's a sort of a qualifier that they did that so often in the Middle Ages. Medieval writers always did that, as if to leave for those who will come after if the Antichrist has not come first, right? That is to say, if I am writing to posterity, but he knows he's not writing to an infinite posterity. He knows that there are those who will come after him, but he doesn't know how many people will come after him. The Antichrist could arise at any time. The world could be coming to an end. Also, another thing that this is a little sign of, and we'll get more signs of that, even just in this first chapter, later in this first chapter, in the prologue even. It is very clear in Adso's narration that he believes that the world is in decline and really close to the end, right? Adso absolutely believes that he is living in what modern Christian evangelicals might call the end times, right? That the end of the world is very, very close. And that if you look around in the world around you, there are signs all over the place that the world is just about to end. And you can expect Antichrist to come any day, basically, because it's clearly almost over now. This was a deep, deep conviction throughout the Middle Ages, that they were near the very end of the world, that the end times were about to come. Admiral Curiatur, I have always found myself quite thoroughly inoculated against modern teachers anybody who tried to convince me. I've been a Christian all my life, raised in an evangelical home, and often heard people trying to convince me that the end times were really upon us. And the more I read, especially of medieval literature, the more I found myself inoculated against this. That I understand why these people think that, but people have been thinking that for a really long time, and it hasn't necessarily been true. And frankly, I think that a medieval European Christian living in the 14th century had a way better case. They had a way better argument. They had much more support behind their argument that the end of the world was coming. Their signs that they could point to are so much better than the signs that modern people point to, I think. Yeah. I mean, I think of, exactly. Going through the Black Death. I mean, there are heartbreaking. I think of I forget the name of the monk, an Irish monk who was the only monk who survived in his monastery. The Black Death killed everyone else in his monastery and in the entire town nearby. He really believed, and had good reason to believe, that he was the only human being left alive in the world, and wrote, because he felt that it was like his job, that he had been left alive in order to record the events of the end of time. When that kind of stuff is going down, right? Like, you can be forgiven for thinking that it's the end of the world, right? So that's the reference to the Antichrist. He's referring to, it's, if the Antichrist has not come, is in Adso's vocabulary a shorthand for if the world has not ended yet, right? If the apocalypse hasn't happened, before that, before you get this. Okay. Anyway, let's get slide 2. I love this sentence. Here's another sentence. May the Lord grant me the grace to be the transparent witness of the occurrences that took place in the abbey, whose name is only right and pious now to omit, toward the end of the year of our Lord 1327, when the Emperor Louis came down into Italy to restore the dignity of the Holy Roman Empire, in keeping with the designs of the Almighty, and the confusion of the wicked usurper, simoniac, and heresiarch, who in Avignon brought shame on the holy name of the apostle. I refer to the sinful soul of Jacques of Cohors, whom the impious revered as John the 22nd. How about that sentence, right? Come on, that's an awesome sentence. Yes, simoniac and heresiarch are really great words, aren't they? Okay, so what does this tell us? First of all, remember when we talked, many of you were with me when we read the Inferno together, Dante's Inferno. And you'll remember when we were talking about Dante, I made an apology and said the vicissitudes of late 13th and early 14th century politics in Florence meant a very, very great deal to Dante, but I wasn't going to get into it, right? I'm going to say much the same thing. I'm not going to get into the details of the Emperor Louis and all of that stuff, but let me explain just a little bit what's going. This is basically this is Adso's way of dating what happened. He's providing the context which everyone will remember what was happening about this time. A brief reference, explanation of Avignon and the usurper, simoniac, and heresiarch, John the 22nd. Okay. What he's referring to is the anti-pope. Well, the ones who weren't his supporters called the anti-pope. Basically, there were two. The papal seat got moved in the 13th century from Rome to Avignon in France for political reasons. Rome got a little hot, so the papacy moved to Avignon. But then there was another pope who set up in Rome, and there came to be a time when there were two separate popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome, who did not at all agree as to who was the rightful pope. And by the way, to make it even more fun, there was even a brief time in which a third party who was like, we're sick of all this feuding nonsense, right? Forget the two popes. we're going to say, like, forget both of you. This dude is the Pope. And then, of course, they succeeded in making a third Pope. And so then there were 3 competing popes, and it was even more confusing. Yeah, so this is what was going on there. So obviously he is not a supporter of John the 22nd, who brought shame on the holy name of the apostle, that is the apostle Peter. The Pope, of course, is the heir of the apostle Peter, who sits in the seat of the vicar of Christ. Anyway, so he sits in Peter's seat as the apostle. That's the apostle that he's referring to there. So yes, he is not a fan of John the 22nd, as it happens. Usurper, because he's usurping the title of Pope. He doesn't have any right to be Pope, according to Adso and his party. He is a simoniac. Everyone, that was their favorite insult. You may remember the simoniacs. If you have a particularly acute memory, you may recall that the simoniacs were those chaps who were head down in hell with their feet on fire in Dante's Inferno. Yes, JJ remembers. Yeah, exactly. So a simoniac, this is a very specific kind of sin. The sin of simony is when you sell spiritual things for worldly gain, right? So like, for instance, if someone were to come to, if you were to have the power to absolve someone from their sins, let's just say on a theoretical basis, and somebody were to come to you and say, hey, I can slip you a bit of green if you give me some absolution, right? I'll pay you, and then you give me some forgiveness, and everybody leaves happy, right? If you say yes to this unholy proposition, you are guilty of the sin of simony. And that makes you a simoniac. What this meant in practice is that any person of authority in the church whom you disagree with and you think is acting for corrupt motivations, you're going to accuse of being a simoniac. It's a very niche sin, but it's thrown around all the time when you're talking about bad popes and cardinals and bishops and priests that you don't like. Okay. Anyway, so that's what simony is. That's what a simoniac is. A heresiarch, of course, is a heretic. But it's not just a heretic. A heresiarch is like the originator and like proselytizer for a heresy, right? You're a heretic if you believe something that is false, right? If a heresy, which is an untrue doctrine, if you embrace a heresy, congratulations, you're a heretic. If you come up with a heresy and you teach that heresy to others and get other people to adhere to your heresy, then, my friend, you are a heresiarch. So John the 22nd is all three of those things because he did all these bad things and was the first one to do them. Anyway, so that's also they name it after you, the heresy. Yes, it's true. Yes. The Arian heresy was founded by the heresiarch Arius, right? Exactly. Pelagius, the first British heresiarch, right? There you go. Okay. Anyhow, that's what those particular insults mean. Moving on. That's how we do political context, but I'm not going to get into the politics. Near the end of the prologue. In the pages to follow, I shall not indulge in descriptions of persons, except when a facial expression or a gesture appears as a sign of a mute but eloquent language. Because, as Boethius says, nothing is more fleeting than external form, which withers and alters like the flowers of the field at the appearance of autumn. And what would be the point of saying today that the Abbot Abbo had a stern eye and pale cheeks, when by now he and those around him are dust, and their bodies have the mortal greyness of dust, only their souls, God grant, shining with a light that will never be extinguished? But I would like to describe William at least once, because his singular features struck me, and it is characteristic of the young to become bound to an older and wiser man not only by the spell of his words and the sharpness of his mind, but also by the superficial form of his body, which proves very dear, like the figure of a father, whose gestures we study and whose frowns, whose smile we observe, without a shadow of lust, to pollute this form, perhaps the only that is truly pure, of corporal love. Okay. You will notice that this paragraph is 2 sentences. But anyway, okay. Again, notice he is, another side note that will be delightful to people who know Latin. Why is Umberto Eco using such long sentences? Because he is imitating not only the rhetorical style, but the syntactical structure of Latin sentences. He's translating from Latin. So he's making as if he's translating from Latin. I would say further, he's trying to convey, in, of course, Italian originally, we're reading an English translation, but he's trying to convey the sense, a feeling of the Latin structure. Even though you're reading it in the vulgar tongue, and especially if you're reading it in English, which is even more vulgar than many tongues, but still, if you're reading it in the vernacular, which is where Umberto Eco wrote it, he still wants you to get a sense of the flow of the Latin thought. Yes, it's the experience of reading a Latin text. Exactly. Okay. Notice, do you see again that theme of signs and things that comes up in that first sentence? Why is he not going to indulge in descriptions of persons? Because what does it matter? The character of the Abbot Abbo. What does it matter how we can picture him in our heads, right? Merely to try to paint a clearer picture so that we can know exactly what the Abbot Abbo looked like, what his hair was like, what his face was like, what his body odor was like, right? I mean, we don't need to know. We don't need to know those things, right? Those things don't matter. They don't have, and I use this word very carefully, significance. They don't point to anything, right? The bodies, it doesn't matter, right? Why? Because nothing is more fleeting than external form, as Boethius teaches us, which withers and alters like the flowers of the field at the appearance of autumn. Why should we care about the Abbot Abbo's stern eye and pale cheeks? He is now dust, and his body has the mortal grayness of dust, even though his soul, God grant, shines with a light that will never be extinguished, right? It doesn't matter, right? Yes, Liz points out that sneakily Echo's got that description in there anyway. It's perfectly true. Perfectly true. He does give an exception, right? He is going to describe persons when a facial expression, gesture, or a gesture appears as a sign of a mute but eloquent language. Again, what does he care about? What is he doing? What does he feel his job as a narrator to be? To faithfully record the signs, though not always to tell us what they pointed to, right? Or even he might say, in a sense, like for instance, you may remember that in the 3rd chapter, in the terce chapter, Brother William says something which causes Abbot Abbo to raise his hands in surprise, right? Losing his gravity and decorum in that moment. So taken aback and surprised was he by what Brother William said. Adso will tell us that gesture, what it pointed to in the sense of what it was a sign of, what feelings, what stirrings of mind and of thought and emotion within the Abbot Abbo that gesture indicated, right? What it was a sign of. What is the thing that sign pointed to in that literal sense? But we don't know what that points to in another sense, right? What does it tell us that he expressed so much surprise in that moment about that thing? That itself could be a sign of something else, right? And that level of signification is usually something that Adso is not going to explain because he doesn't know, right? Because poor Adso is too dumb to figure out these things, right? The fragmentary passages of nature are too illegible for him to read. So, right, would an external form be a red herring then, Mrs. Manrique? Possibly, right? Again, in not telling us everything, describing everything that happens, he could be taking a risk. Because some of those things could be signs that he doesn't understand. He doesn't even recognize that they are important signs. Sometimes he knows that things are signs pointing to something he doesn't get, right? Sometimes, though, he may miss things, right? So yes, there is some irony. Who was just talking about this? Yes. Steve Keen was just saying this is ironic in light of the lengthy descriptions of ephemeral events later in the narrative. Yes, it is, but it's also an indication. It's also an indication that that Adso, may believe that the thing that he's describing is important, is a faithful signal, though he doesn't know of what exactly. Yes, Abbo is the abbot's name, but yes, it sounds like his name is Abbot, right? The abbot whose name is Abbot. I don't think that's an accident, right? Remember, he has said at the beginning he's going to conceal the name of this abbey, right? Because he doesn't want to, stain this, clearly he's going to be telling us some scandalous things, right? So he is drawing a veil over the name of this monastery. And I think he's drawing a veil over the name of the abbot as well. I think that's one of the reasons why he basically calls him Abbot. It's designed, I think, to be generic. Okay. I'll try to make it a very brief note. Brief note about the shadow of lust polluting this form of corporal love. Just as we saw back at the beginning, an entire 2 slides ago, how the world is amalgamated with a will wholly bent on evil. On the one hand, that's a reference to the devil. It's also just a reference to people. People's wills are wholly bent on evil. The human will is corrupt. Even when you're doing a thing which is not sinful, your desires and motivations are going to be all tangled up with sinful desires. In particular, the fundamental nature of lust, that is, of sexual desire. In the Middle Ages, we believe in this very firmly, that Men and women cannot look at each other without corrupt sexual desire, so that there can be no corporal love. There can be no corporal relationship, which is not in some degree or other polluted by the shadow of lust. This is one of the reasons monasteries exist, by the way, and why monasteries and nunneries are single-sex locations, right? But yes, exactly, Carrie. Adso is claiming that his love for William is pure, like the love of a son for his father, untainted by lust in that way. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to get too far down this particular rabbit hole, but this was a big deal in the Middle Ages, and we can see this coming out. This will be relevant at various different points. Okay. Let's keep going. Notice this little aside that I almost skipped this passage, but I'm like, I can't skip this passage. Adso just digresses towards the end of his prologue. In the past, men were handsome and great. Now they are children and dwarfs. But this is merely one of the many facts that demonstrate the disaster of an aging world. The young no longer want to study anything. Learning is in decline. The whole world walks on its head. Blind men lead others equally blind and cause them to plunge into the abyss. Birds leave the nest before they can fly. The jackass plays the lyre. Oxen dance. Mary no longer loves the contemplative life, and Martha no longer loves the active life. Leah is sterile. Rachel has a carnal eye. Cato visits brothels. Everything is diverted from its proper course. In those days, thank God, I acquired from my master the desire to learn and a sense of the straight way, which remains even when the path is tortuous. Yeah, Tomas says, I so totally love this paragraph. Yeah, dogs and cats living together, Jocelyn, is exactly how I wanted to end that first sentence as well. In my household, my wife can rarely find an occasion in which a quotation from Pride and Prejudice or Ghostbusters will not fit the occasion. But anyway, yes. This is a really medieval paragraph, right? They talked like this all the time. Of course, many of these things are direct quotations. About the jackass playing the lyre, for instance, is a famous quotation of a quotation. Yeah. Anyway, oh man, Adam, it is so true that every generation always thinks that this generation is more degenerate than the previous one. Absolutely. Everything is in decline. You guys will have often, I'm sure, heard me talk about this in the context of Tolkien, how in Tolkien's Middle-earth, we can see evidence of Tolkien thinking in similar kinds of terms. This idea that things are declining, getting lesser and lesser over time, and that, the ancients in the old days were greater. Notice physically so. Right. In the past, men were handsome and great. Now they are children and dwarfs. Like the people that we see walking around are like ugly and stunted compared to the great and handsome of the time before. Anyway, so yeah. Anyhow, so the notice the second sentence. The second sentence, he gets into specific moral decline as well, that things have changed from the way that they should be. Mary and Martha. This is not Mary, the Virgin Mary. We're not talking about the Virgin Mary. We're talking about the story of Mary and Martha of Bethany. The two. So it's they're in a number of stories in the Gospels. There are two sisters of Lazarus who dies and Jesus resurrects in the Gospel of John. But anyway, Mary and Martha, there's a famous story where Jesus comes to Mary and Martha's house and Mary is bustling around like she's doing hospitality, right? She's bustling around and like getting everything ready, and because it's a big deal, like Jesus has come and lots of people have come with him, and they have to be hostesses and stuff, right? So Martha is bustling around doing all these things. Sorry, did I say the wrong thing? I apologize if I misspoke and confused things. Martha is the one bustling around, but Mary is sitting at Jesus's feet listening to his teaching. He's teaching, and Mary is sitting in front of him listening to his teaching. And Martha gets upset. Martha comes in and complains, and she's like, dude. Okay, she doesn't say dude. She says, Master, there's like work to be done, right? I'm working myself to the bone over here, and she's just lazing about, listening and not participating in all these active things that I'm doing, right? And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, she has chosen the better part, right? So he says, like, she's doing work too. You're doing what you're doing is great. What she's doing is great too. And the two of them, Mary and Martha, from that story, became throughout the Middle Ages the dominant metaphors for the active and the contemplative life. If you live a normal life in the world and you get married and you have a job and you work in the fields and you or you become a merchant or whatever, you're like Martha, right? You are doing important work, right? Important work that makes the world go round, right? No harm in that. That is an important calling. But there are some who choose to follow the way of Mary, right? The contemplative life. Those who put themselves aside from the mundane labor of life and instead focus on the teachings of the Master, right? So Mary is an allegory for the monks and the religious orders, and Martha is the metaphor for everybody else, basically. So when he talks about this decline of the world, Mary no longer loves the contemplative life. Martha no longer loves the active life, right? Everything is topsy-turvy and leaving its place. Leah is sterile. Leah and Rachel, right? The two wives of the patriarch Jacob from the book of Genesis, right? Leah had a whole bunch of kids, right? Rachel is a faithful and virtuous woman. This is the medieval story, certainly, about Rachel, right? Leah is now sterile. She can't have kids. Rachel is lascivious, right? And Cato visits brothels. So then he's got these two New Testament characters, two Old Testament characters, and one classical character, right? Cato the Elder, who was famously, strictly, morally upright. He was a symbol of self-control and denial of the desires of the flesh. So that's where, and so, Cato's visiting brothels these days. Everything is on its head. Everything is diverted from its proper course. Okay. Anyway, this is such a medieval paragraph. Again, it's through paragraphs like this, which don't seem at all important, at all relevant to the flow of the story, right? But which really, I think, do such a wonderful job of inviting us into, like, we can enter into Adso's secondary world, right? We can notice the way that he looks at the world around him. And notice that last sentence. Everything is diverted from its proper course. In those days, thank God, I acquired from my master the desire to learn and a sense of the straight way, which remains even when the path is tortuous, meaning windy, right? He doesn't always travel the straight way, but he has a sense of it, right? Thanks to his master, he's acquired the desire to learn and a sense of the straight way. He knows that there is a straight way out there, even when things wind, remember back to the signs pointing to incontrovertible truth, even when we can't see it or know it. Jack Rabbit, the mixture of biblical and classical characters is totally medieval. They did this all the time. All the time. They were great readers of classical Latin stuff and held, they held Aeneas in like as high regard as they held, well, maybe not Abraham. He was a special case, but like, other like great, heroes from the Bible. David, maybe. Yeah, maybe. They did not, I think, Carrie, I think that's perfectly fair to say. They had a different taxonomy of sacred and secular. I would be very careful with those words, by the way, as those mean different things in the Middle Ages than they do nowadays. But anyway, they, one of the things that I found in my years teaching medieval literature is that many modern students had the idea that medieval people like only knew the Bible, that they refused to read any, non-Christians, non-biblical stuff, that they would be like really, really prudish about the idea of reading, secular literature. Totally not true. At all, like the opposite of truth. Yeah. Mortal hamster, or that they were illiterate. Yes. Or I would add that mere illiteracy interfered at all with their being quite well read and thoughtful. You do not have to be illiterate in order to be very familiar with literature. I can speak to this myself, because I am in fact literate. The amount of reading that I do very, very rarely involves my eyes. Almost all of the literary discussions that I have, I could have just the same if I were illiterate. That's how the medieval world was for most people, because there aren't a lot of books. Anyway, okay, but I don't want to get too distracted about that. Of Brother William, I have perhaps said things without sense, as if to collect from the very beginning the disjointed impressions of him that I had then. Who he was, and what he was doing, my good reader, you will perhaps deduce better from what he did in the days we spent in the Abbey. Nor do I promise you an accomplished design, but rather a tale of events, those, yes, wondrous and awful. I really love the persona of Adzo as narrator. Notice the kinds of disclaimers that he's making here, right? I am saying things without sense. Like, if the stuff that I say doesn't make sense, that's just because I don't myself understand it. I'm just collecting disjointed impressions. These are the signs of signs, right? I'm telling you the things that I saw so that, remember, you can prayerfully interpret what those signs point to, right? Who he was, what he was doing, what these signs point to. What is the real Brother William? What is the significance of Brother William? And that question can be answered on so many levels, right? What was he actually doing? What was his purpose? What was he trying to accomplish? What did he accomplish? What was important about what he accomplished? What is the importance about what he was trying to accomplish, and how what he tried to accomplish led him to do what he did, and the significance of what he did, right? And what do those things in turn point to, and how can they help to guide our lives? What ultimate truths do they point to, right? These are all things that we can get from these signs. His job, all he claims to be able to do, is present the signs, is describe the signs. It may be disjointed, right? It may be things without sense. Well, no. Okay, it's possible, Jackrabbit, that that things without sense are things that are not signs. I think it more likely that he means things that are like signs that are pointing to things that I don't know, right? I can't make sense of it interpretively, right? I can't tell you what they're pointing to. But they're so and they may be things without sense, right? They may in fact not. He may be presenting us things thinking they might be signs of something important, and maybe they're not, because he doesn't even understand enough to filter them properly, right? Again, he said, notice how he kind of distances himself from the whole thing, right? It may be that I'm confused. And by the way, this whole approach to being the narrator is so medieval. This posture of a narrator being like, I barely even know what I'm talking about, right? I can't, I'm just a humble recorder of things. Chaucer, of course, is the one who will go on absolutely to master the posture of narrator. Yes, this trope of the humility trope in medieval narrators, super common. And as I say, Chaucer's the one who really turned it into a sublime art form, which is so gorgeous. Yes, is my favorite thing about Chaucer. But anyway, yeah. Nor do I promise you an accomplished design. I don't have a strategy here. I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to give you a tale of events, wondrous and awful, right? The things I will describe are pretty shocking, right? Those, yes. But what does it mean? I don't know what it means. Bricktails, that's exactly right. If we start by saying the only incontrovertible truth is the creation, right? Remember where words and things are the same. Any other narrative is at best iffy. Yep, exactly. And he's set that up very clearly here. Yes. All right. I'm tempted to stop because we did get through the entire prologue, but let's, this, of course, the first chapter, the opening scene is one of the most Sherlockian moments, explicitly Sherlockian moments. Let's look at a little bit of that though, because again, Echo, is, I think, delightfully convincing to me. Convincing in the sense, I am very willing to invest secondary belief in his secondary world here. I think that he has really marvelously fulfilled the what if. We should be remembering Sherlock Holmes. We can almost hardly avoid remembering Sherlock Holmes in these descriptions. And yet, we mustn't allow that to pull us out of the secondary world that he's building. And he gives us reasons not to. So I thank you, brother cellarer, my master replied politely, and I appreciate your courtesy all the more, since in order to greet me, you have interrupted your search. But don't worry. The horse came this way and took the path to the right. He will not get far, because he will have to stop when he reaches the dung heap. He is too intelligent to plunge down that precipitous slope. When did you see him? The cellarer asked. We haven't seen him at all, have we, Edso? William said, turning toward me with an amused look. But if you are hunting for Brunellus, the horse can only be where I have said. The cellarer hesitated. He looked at William, then at the path, and finally asked, Brunellus? How did you know? Come, William said. It is obvious you are hunting for Brunellus, the abbot's favorite horse. 15 hands, the fastest in your stables, with a dark coat, a full tail, small round hoofs, but a very steady gait, small head, sharp ears, big eyes. He went to the right, as I said, but you should hurry in any case. Awesome. Yes, Adam, a cellarer, that's a position of significant responsibility because they're the ones who control the cellars, that is, the stores of food and wine for the monasteries. So you put somebody in charge of the food and drink that you trust to dole that out. Yeah, anyway, okay. 15 hands is the height of the horse at the shoulder, traditionally. Now, one thing to notice about Brother William here is that he does seem to like to show off, right? He's a lot like Sherlock Holmes in that way, right? His explanations are really fun, though. Let's look at some of his explanations. Adso asks how he could possibly have known all these things about a horse he did not see. My good Adso, my master said, during our whole journey, I have been teaching you to recognize the evidence through which the world speaks to us like a great book. Alanus de Insulis said that omnis mundi creatura, quasi liber et pictura, nobis est in speculum. Okay, we can do this. Omnis mundi creatura. All the creatures of the world, quasi liber et pictura, like a book or a picture, nobis, to us, est in speculum, are to us in a mirror. Speculum is the word for mirror. Okay. All of the creatures of the world, like a book or a picture, are to us in a mirror. This is what Alanus de Insulis says that Brother William is quoting, right? So note how after the whole prologue in which he is Adso is setting us up to understand his narrative in this whole sign and thing, right? He is, creatura is singular, every creature of the world. Sorry, yeah. Eric, feel free to correct my rather free translation of the Latin when it comes up. I will often be sloppy and probably at times quite wrong. So feel free to correct me. Anyway. Yeah, exactly. You're rusty too. Well, that's the fun of this, right? Again, it will be fun. One of the things I'm looking forward to in reading this book is brushing up my Latin, which, as I said before. Okay. Having set us up in the prologue to see that his role as narrator is all about just faithfully recording signs that will point to things, that will point to truths that he himself does not understand. The very beginning of his narrative is Brother William lecturing Adso about signs and things and their relationship, and teaching him the very thing that he was telling us in the prologue, right? About how we see all things in a glass, in a speculum, right? We see everything in a speculum darkly. All of the creatures of the world are like a book or a picture. They're signs pointing to things, right? One idea that's really important here, another medieval idea that underlies this. I have been teaching you, he says, to recognize the evidence through which the world speaks to us like a great book. That simile, that the world is like a book, is a very important medieval idea. The Latin is poetry. Yeah. Anyway, there was a very important medieval doctrine, which was called the doctrine of the two books. Simply put, it goes like this. God wrote two books, the Bible and creation. So the Bible is the book that's written by God, dictated by God. It is It is the authoritative word of God. But the word of God, the words of God, were manifested in creation itself. Nature itself, the world itself, history itself is also a book that is written by God. So there's the book of the world, and there's the holy book. There's the book of Scripture, right? Both of these two things are books that are written by God. And sometimes one will point to the other, sometimes both of them. If you can see the signs in both of them, you can understand the truth better, the truth that both are pointing to, right? The higher truth that they're both pointing to. Brother William, so when our medieval Sherlock here starts explaining his scientific method, instead of talking about, as Sherlock Holmes does in the first Sherlock Holmes story, The Study in Scarlet, about the science of deduction and his monograph about cigar ash. Instead, Brother William quotes Alanus de Insulis and starts telling us about signs and things. So Alanus de Insulis says this, now going on, and he was thinking of the endless array of symbols with which God, through his creatures, speaks to us of the eternal life. Everything that happens points to spiritual things, points to ultimate truth. We don't always see it, but it always does. But the universe is even more talkative than Alanus thought, and it speaks not only of the ultimate things, which it does always in an obscure fashion. That is, it doesn't just tell us about ultimate spiritual truths, but also of closer things. And then it speaks quite clearly. I am most embarrassed to repeat to you what you should know. At the crossroads, on the still fresh snow, a horse's hoofprint stood out very neatly, heading for the path to our left. Neatly spaced, those marks said that the hoof was small and round, and the gallop quite regular, and so I deduced the nature of the horse, and the fact that it was not running wildly like a crazed animal. At the point where the pines formed a natural roof, some twigs had been freshly broken off, at a height of 5 feet. One of the blackberry bushes, where the animal must have turned to take the path to his right, proudly switching his handsome tail, still held some long black horsehairs in its brambles. You will not say, finally, that you do not know that path leads to the dung heap, because as we passed the lower curve, we saw the spill of waste down the sheer cliff below the Great East Tower, staining the snow, and from the situation of the crossroads, the path could only lead in that direction. His deductions are, within Brother William's worldview, the interpretation of signs which point to things. The thing is the horse, but there were many signs that pointed to the horse. And although all signs in the Bible and in the world point to ultimate things, you can draw spiritual lessons from all things, because the books that God wrote are always talking about the truths of God, which are revealed through these things. Everybody knows that. And Brother William acknowledges that. But he says they also speak of closer things, and then they speak quite clearly, right? So is this the escaped horse and the signs that it left? Could we interpret that and come to understand an ultimate truth? Could that tell us something about the nature of God, or, sort of form for us some sort of spiritual allegory of ultimate things? Yeah. But more proximately, it said a brown horse of about this height, with about this gait and training, passed this way, right? And went down there. Exactly. He doesn't see the horse. He sees the sign of the horse. Exactly, Mrs. Manrique. And yes, you are thinking just like a medieval person when you recall Jesus calling people out for interpreting the signs of the skies for weather patterns and not knowing the spiritual signs. Yes, that is exactly the kind of interpretation of the book of nature that the people in the Middle Ages were talking about. Okay, so, but let's keep going. Almost done. I know we're late now, but I just wanted to finish this little sequence. Yes, I said, but what about the small head, the sharp ears, the big eyes? I love this paragraph so much. I am not sure he has those features, but no doubt the monks firmly believe he does. As Isidore of Seville said, the beauty of a horse requires that the head be small, sicum propre pella ossibus adhaerente, just as is, I'm not going to be able to do the whole thing. He's quoting the description of the bones of the horse's head being small. Erect neck, thick mane and tail, round and solid hoofs. Isidore of Seville, it was called the etymologist. He wrote an encyclopedia, basically, a very famous medieval encyclopedia. And so Isidore of Seville is the source of enormous amounts of learning, right? He has great, to use the important Latin word, Isidore of Seville has enormous auctoritas, authority. If Isidore of Seville says that something is true, it must certainly be true, right? And if you know your Isidore of Seville, you will know what he tells you about what a beautiful horse looks like, right? And he describes it in exactly the way that Brother William was quoting Isidore of Seville to the cellarer. Short and pointed ears, big eyes, flaring nostrils, erect neck, thick mane and tail, round and solid hoofs. That is how Isidore of Seville describes a beautiful horse. If the horse whose passing I inferred had not really been the finest of the stables, stable boys would have been out chasing him, but instead the cellarer in person had undertaken the search. And a monk who considers a horse excellent, whatever his natural forms, can only see him as the auctoritates that is, the authoritative writers, have described him, especially if, and here he smiled slyly in my direction, the describer is a learned Benedictine. He was speaking the cellarer's language, right? Knowing that the cellarer must believe this horse beautiful and valuable because he was searching for him himself, right? Having deduced that the cellarer must believe that this horse is beautiful and important. He knows, Brother William knows, that he would describe him with short and pointed ears, big eyes, flaring nostrils, erect neck, thick mane and tail, because the cellarer is a learned Benedictine who's read his Isidore of Seville, and that's what beautiful horses look like. Does this mean? What does this mean about what the horse looks like? Brother William says the monks would describe him that way, even if it weren't true. Even if he had big floppy ears and a big ugly head and beady eyes. If they value him and believe him to be beautiful, they will tend to describe him in the terms that the auctoritates use to describe beautiful horses. What Brother William has just given us is a satire on Benedictine monks. Hence, who was just saying that? Yes, Steve. Steve Keane says, the sly smile of Brother William. He says, fleeting external form alert. Yes, exactly. Brother William, Adso has told us about the sly smile of Brother William because he believes that sly smile to be a sign of something important, right? Which Adso either doesn't understand or can pretend not to understand. Because what it points to is Brother William is teasing the Benedictine monks. He's saying, I know how Benedictines think, right? Benedictines are going to describe a beautiful horse like Isidore of Seville describes beautiful horses, even if the horse doesn't look that way, right? Because to them, the ideal of a beautiful horse is more important than the actuality of that horse, right? Yes, Eric, as you say, can only see him as implies that they might honestly convince themselves that it matches that ideal. Yes, exactly. So he's teasing. Why? Notice here briefly the effect of Adzo's disclaimers in the prologue, right? How he has set himself up as narrator. Adzo is a Benedictine, right? The aged Adzo who is writing this is a Benedictine, and his work is certainly going to be read by other Benedictines, including the superior of his own abbot, certainly is going to read the book that he writes, right? And, some of the other Benedictines who read this might feel a little insulted at Brother William's sly smile here. But notice what Adzo has opened up, right? He can say, if the abbot says, why was Brother William smiling slyly when he spoke so wisely about Isidore of Seville? Adzo can be like, I just report the signs. I don't know all the things they point to, right? I believe that he meant something by it, but what it was, I just don't know. Yeah. So, little Franciscan Benedictine rivalry going on here, which will happen a lot, actually. No, it's natural to think that Adzo is a Franciscan because he's coming in as the novice of Brother William here. I only say he's a Benedictine because of his own description of himself as a monk, and as, the way that he talks about the dear Abbey of Melk, which he has been apparently a member of for a very long time. I think he clearly has become a monk in Melk, and is not wandering the world as a Franciscan. But here in his young days, before he had taken orders at all, he's traveling around with his learned Franciscan and learning all of these things, some of which, he remembers fondly, but doesn't necessarily want to throw his own weight behind. Yeah. Okay. All right. It's late. I'm overindulging myself here this evening. So we got halfway through tonight's reading, so that's promising. Let's keep moving forward. Let's try. Go up toward Nons, but stop there. So you'll get to the chapter. Of course, the chapters are all divided up by the monastic hours. It's 7 days that occur, right? And so we get the hours of the day. We're still in day 1. So we're going to stop at toward Nons, in which William has a very erudite conversation with Severinus the herbalist. So I'm going to say don't read that chapter. You can carry on reading if you'd like, but I will have no ambitions of going past that chapter, and we'll see how far we get. So yes, read up to, but not include, toward Nons is what it's called. It's not just called Nons itself. There's toward Nons and after Nons. So we'll see how far we get next time. I knew today we'd have to do a whole bunch of foundational stuff. So we should move. I'm planning to move a little bit more quickly as we move forward. All right. Thanks everybody. We should have class next week. As far as I know, I will be here unless Antichrist comes between now and then. But thanks everybody, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Bye now.